Hello and welcome to the second little video um, in which I talk about the history of English, and this video focuses on the Middle English period. Just one thing before we begin, Middle English is a strange term, and it was coined in the 19th century by German scholars who were looking at the past forms of Germanic languages and basically came up with this division. So for us, this means that the English of Geoffrey Chaucer, for example, which is Middle English, is recognizably different from the earliest English we find, that would be Old English. And it's also recognizably different from present day English. And so just in order to have a term for this particular variety of English, we call it Middle English for that reason. Yeah, the same is also true for Middle High German, Middle Dutch, and so on. Other Germanic languages also have a historical division like that. Okay, I already showed you this slide in the first video. So just as a reminder, the Middle English period runs from the middle of the 12th century until the end of the 15th century, roughly. And we can say that the event that sparked the beginning of the Middle English period is the Norman Conquest of England. And an important innovation towards the end of the Middle English period is the introduction of the printing press by William Caxton in the 1470s. Right, another thing that you already saw in the first video is this, the fact that the Germanic language we're talking about, namely the English language, was brought to the British Isles from the middle of the 5th century, and that's what we then refer to as Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, and as another little reminder of the things that happened before the Middle English time, only very briefly today in a nutshell, we have Celtic speakers, Celtic languages coming to Britain in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC already. Then within Celtic Britain, there's this time of almost 400 years in which Celtic Britain is under Roman rule. So you additionally then have some Latin-speaking Roman soldiers in the southern half of Britain. And then in the Anglo-Saxon period itself, I talked about the Germanic conquest of the British Isles in the middle, beginning in the middle of the 5th century, which gives us the Old English language, of course. I talked about the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, which began shortly before the year 600, which gives us written Old English or historical Old English. So all of these texts are then being written between this time and the Norman Conquest. And another thing I mentioned is the beginning of the Viking Age, around about the year 800 AD, which means for us that particularly in the northeast of what is today England, the language that the Scandinavian settlers and their descendants brought with them, Old Norse, started influencing spoken Old English in this region. Okay, and the next milestone or major political event that we should focus on now is the Norman Conquest of the year 1066. Okay, if we talk about the Norman Conquest, we also need to talk about Normans, right? Who are the Normans? So, first of all, the word Norman is ultimately descended from a Germanic word. So, it does mean North people, Northmen, literally. And why are they called Northmen? Well, because they were descendants of Vikings. Vikings started attacking not only England, but also the northern coast of France and settling there in the 9th and 10th centuries. So this was the same time as the Viking Age in England was going on. Right. In France, however, it took until 912 for there to be an agreement. So the Viking leader or the Danish leader, Rollo, came to an agreement with Charles the Simple, King of France at the time, which led to the foundation of the Duchy of Normandy. The Normans were descendants of Vikings, as I already said, And of course, they also then mixed, genetically speaking, with Gallo-Roman and Frankish people. Their ethnic identity was pretty unique, so they were not the same thing as Vikings. Normandy itself can be considered a sort of cultural melting pot at the time. Their religion was Christianity. Their language was French, so these things clearly distinguish them from the Vikings of the Viking Age. Their politics, their administration, and some of their laws were Carolingian, and they got into shipbuilding. They produced very large buildings. They had a formidable um, military power, or they were a military power, and their intellectual achievements were also impressive. Certain philosophers of the time came from Normandy, and so on. So they were quite an impressive and quite a unique people. Okay, the Norman conquest of England then, interestingly, is spread out over the entire year 1066. So it all begins when the king of the Anglo-Saxons, Edward the Confessor at the time, in the first week of January, died and left no heirs behind. A little bit about Edward the Confessor. He himself had basically grown up in Normandy, spent many years in exile in Normandy before he became a king. And when he ruled England, he brought Norman people into certain important positions in Anglo-Saxon England. So there was this whole Norman thing already going on even before 1066. Okay, he died. One day later, Harold Godwinson, another influential figure in Wessex, in Anglo-Saxon England at the time, was elected king instead. But this wasn't so very clear who would actually become the next king. And it seems to be the case that other people who thought that they might become the next king of England did have their reasons to think this. So one of them was William the Great, Duke of Normandy, who was also related to Edward the Confessor. And he had some expectations to become the next king of England. Apparently, he had also been promised this. It kind of depends on which historical source you want to look into and who you want to really believe about what happened. But it seems to be the case that Harold Godwinson himself had actually promised that he would not run for king, so to speak, but he did. And of course, William was very enraged about this then. Okay, there were also other people, by the way, that I'm just completely leaving out of the picture right now. So there was the King of Norway, for example, who was also attacking England in the same year, at the same time then. But I'm just going to completely leave that part out of it for now and just concentrate on the Norman conquest. So what happened is that William then invaded England with a huge force in the fall of that year. The huge force I'm talking about was, of course, his own army, but also other people, mercenaries, people that were paid to fight for the Normans. And with the Pope's blessing, so they invaded England, and this led to the Battle of Hastings in October of 1066. The Battle of Hastings was lost by the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon king Harold was killed during the Battle of Hastings, and many other people were killed in the battle or after the Battle of Hastings. And William and his force made their way to to London. And in London on Christmas Day, so right before the end of the year, William is crowned the King of England. Right. After the Norman conquest, William then went on to basically wipe out the English nobility, which means replacing many of the important Anglo-Saxon people by his own Norman followers, French-speaking people. We don't really know how many French-speaking people then started coming to England after the Norman conquest. But the important thing is that these people made up the ruling class. In other words, the people who could read and write. So the people that we have to be interested in because they're the ones leaving written sources behind so that we can study the language, right? So all of a sudden, after 1066, there's not really English texts anymore. Everything is now French and Latin, and hardly any English. So we're left with a strange multilingual situation in England after 1066. The ruling class speaking French, not speaking English, most of them, and the unlearned majority speaking but not writing English because they can't read and write. So even if we say that maybe 95% of the people in England spoke English and nothing but English, this doesn't really matter to us as historical linguists because these people are not leaving behind any written sources. So at the time, there seems to have been a true language gap with generations of kings of Norman descent somehow managing to rule this country without ever really having to speak a whole lot of English, which is kind of interesting too. So what you see here is a map of the Norman Empire at the height of its power, at the height of its geographic extent as well, around about the year 1200. We also have not only this strange language gap, but also a transmission gap if we look at the texts that survive from this period. Because as I already said, after the Norman Conquest, practically no new texts were being written in English. And this is true until about the 1150s, which is why we sometimes say Middle English really begins in the 1150s. The second continuation of the Peterborough Chronicle seems to have been written in 1154, and this is sometimes called the first Middle English text. Now you see a part of this text here on the right side. The text is what you see printed relatively large, and the small things above and below the text are glosses. So at the top you have translations into modern English. At the bottom you have alternative forms, so Old English forms. What would these words have looked like if this were still Old English? But let's concentrate just on the text right now. I'm going to just try to read it out to you. It says there, "Tha soneth thereafter sendeth the king his writ over all England, and bade his bishops and his abbates and his thanes all, that he shoulden come to his Gewittenemot on Candlemas day to Gloucester him to Janus, and he swa didden." Okay, just looking at some small portions of that and seeing how the language is starting to change. If you see this for the first time, you might think, well, that's just like the Old English that we saw in the last video, but it's not really. If you look exactly at the forms that are suggested as true Old English forms, so to speak, beneath the text, if you look at line 4 and 5, there's it says there that they should come. So that he shoulden kommen. If you look at the Old English forms beneath, it says that he sheldon kuman, right? So in other words, the vowels in the unstressed syllables in the second syllables are changing now. We're moving from he sheldon kuman in Old English, so that would have been the case about 100 years earlier, to he shalden kommen. So in other words, what seems to be happening there is that there's always an E in the spelling in the second syllable. So what seems to have happened, if I interpret this, is that the O's and A's and E's and so on that used to be there in unstressed syllables in Old English are now being reduced to a simple schwa sound, probably. Something like Sheldon instead of Shaldon, right? Or Kummen instead of Kuman. Another thing, if you look at the last line there, it says, he swa didn't. Again, in Old English, you would have he swa dudon, right? There would have been an aw sound there, something like that, probably. And now we just simply have an E in the spelling there instead. So it's almost like the unstressed syllables are not so important anymore. They're being reduced to just a very simple sound, probably. And then ultimately, of course, they get dropped completely, as you know, right? In modern English, we say they did, right? One syllable only. They should come, right? So Sheldon, kommen, should come today. So ultimately, the second syllable gets dropped completely. But this is already happening. This is already beginning in the earliest Middle English, which is why I guess we then call this Middle English. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind now, switching over to internal language history. Remember, I always switch between external and internal language history. So now looking at the language itself, from a bird's eye perspective, we can say that in the Middle English period, we have a lot of morphological simplification with the reduction of vowels, as you just saw it, to a schwa sound in unstressed syllables. This then leads to the simplification of grammatical forms, a gradual loss of inflections over time. On the other hand, then, word order and prepositions become more important. And these two things are really two sides of the same coin, because if you're losing inflections, if you're not marking in a word whether let's say something is an adjective, whether something is maybe a dative case or an accusative case, if you're not really marking that in adjectives or in nouns or in pronouns, then you have to find some other means to help your listener or your reader decide what is the direct object, what is the indirect object, what is the subject, and so on of a sentence. So in order to encode that grammatical information, what English now does instead is it uses much more rigid word orders, and it makes use of a lot of prepositions instead of changing the forms of words like it used to. So you can say things like, I gave the book to him, right? And so the word to becomes very important there. If you leave that out, it's kind of strange. Then you need to signal it differently. You need to signal via the word order who is the recipient and what the object is that's being given. Okay, but that's just a little point of illustration that I just came up with here. Okay, Middle English has been called the non-standard period, as I already said in the first video. Right, and this means that we never had a standard form. We never had a prestigious form of English in the Middle English period. Because English had become the language of the lower classes only, Middle English couldn't have a written standard. Most writing took place in Latin and French at first, and English itself only gradually became an important language again, but it didn't have a written standard, and there were no prestigious accents or anything like that. So nothing like RP, where you can say, oh, this is the correct way, so to speak, to pronounce something in Britain today, right? And nothing like the general American accent in America. So all you had were regional accents, regional dialects, and so on. Yeah, the beginning of the Middle English period saw a proliferation of regional spelling habits. And that's just a quote from Scragg. Or I also like this quote from Folk, which I'm also going to read out to you. Middle English differs from Old English in its expression of regional varieties of English. Middle English texts display a great deal of linguistic variation based in regional differences. And this is very, very true of the Middle English period. And it's something that you can put into rather extreme terms. So for example, Smith, 2005, refers to the fact that the word through, if you really look at all of the medieval manuscripts, you will find something like 500 different ways to spell the English word through in all of these manuscripts. And most of them, of course, are coming from the Middle English period. I'm going to say that again because it's so incredible if you hear it for the first time. There are 500 or so different ways to spell the freaking word through in medieval manuscripts. Okay? So that means there's a lot of variation on the level of spelling. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that for now. There's also other forms of variation, not just spelling, of course. But in general, we can distinguish between 5 different dialect regions of Middle English, and you might go back to the first video and compare these to the 4 different dialectal regions of Old English. Of course, there's a lot of overlap there. So we have Northern Middle English, we have West Midlands and East Midlands Middle English. We have Southern Middle English, which pretty much corresponds to the West Saxon region, the most important region of the Anglo-Saxon time. And then we also have Kentish Middle English as well. This is really an abstraction because the reality is much more complicated. So we have many, many more texts that we can localize to different regions than we ever had in the Anglo-Saxon time. And if you look at where these texts are coming from and what the linguistic differences between them really are, it's really, really complicated. And there's not just 5 regions, right? So it's like almost like every single monastery, every single place where texts were being produced had their own way of writing, of spelling things, of using certain words, of using a certain grammar, and so on. Now, the next little thing on our list that we have to mention about Middle English is that Middle English took a lot of loan words from French. And please, what you see here, keep in mind, this is just the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. There are literally thousands of words that we could enumerate here as coming into the English language during the Middle English time from French, from Old French. I've just selected a few. In the book by Baugh and Cable, you have really pages of lists of these kinds of words. Most of the things here that you see are nouns. So if you look at just my little list here, in the first line you see some loan words that have to do with the ruling class itself, with power, let's say, right? So the words baron, noble, dame, reign, royal, state, and empire come from French. Then in the second line, you see words that have to do with religion and with the church. Creator, saint, miracle, mystery, prayer come from French. Then you see words that have something to do with the law, basically, legal terminology. So words like crime or jail or prison or judge. Then you have words connected with fashion, like the word fashion itself, but also perfume, dress, blue, or boots. Then you have words that have to do with, with upper class food, so dining, right? So you have dinner, supper, bacon, sausage, toast, or fruit as some good examples of nouns that are connected with food. Then you have just something that I like to call general upper class activities, upper class activity words. So yeah, things to do in your free time, basically, if you have a lot of free time in the Middle Ages. So dance, forest, park, music, melody, story, rhyme, beauty, color, figure, tone, paper, and tower. Yeah, architectural terms as well. Then, of course, a lot of words that are connected with the army and the navy. So the word army itself, for example, navy, peace, enemy, battle, or spy. Also, the military ranks, right? If you think of military ranks like general and so on, they're also coming from Old French, of course. And then lastly, but maybe most importantly, we have a whole set of just very general words that are almost everyday words, very simple words, very, very frequent words. So here, just some adjectives: nice, real, safe, secret, simple, special, usual. And here are some verbs: to arrive, to betray, to change, to cry, to pass, to pay, and to save. If we look at all this, and please, again, keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's really thousands of words that we could choose here to demonstrate the huge lexical influence that the English language takes from the French language. In the long run, this means that the English language was starting to lose its purely Germanic flavor in terms of its vocabulary that Old English had. Okay, so it's almost like we have a Germanic core vocabulary in English today, which are the words that come from Old English and some of them from Old Norse. So just to name a few of these words, these are actually the most important words in English today come from Germanic. So they come from Old English mostly. These are words like, well, the pronouns I or you, right? They're words like to be, to do, to say, to have, right? And also some very, very important nouns like father, mother, right? Brother, or head, hand, heart, arm, and so on. And also just the most important adjectives, let's say. Adjectives like old or cold or I don't know, take anything like that, right? Any just very, very important words, all of the grammatical words basically as well. So words like and, if, of, by, for, and so on. So these are really the most important words that are coming from Germanic, from Old English, and some of them from Old Norse. We saw some of those exceptions. Just as a reminder, a word like sister is actually the Old Norse form of that word. Or the form are, as in they are, is also from Old Norse. Okay, and now it's like there's this new layer coming on top of the Germanic core vocabulary, which is like a second layer of all of these French words, thousands of new words that are coming in. Some of them are replacing the words, the Old English words that were there earlier, because of course, Old English also had words for music. And for to arrive and so on, right? So those words also existed or sometimes still exist in their Germanic form, but now we have a second layer coming in. So these words that are derived from French that are also very, very close to what you could call core vocabulary. So they're very important words in the English language today, and there's thousands of them. So in summary, what did I just say about the internal language history? Well, Old English was a synthetic language, meaning that it had a lot of inflections. Modern English is a different type of language. It's an analytic language with only fewer inflections. And for all of these things that I'm saying right now, you can see Middle English as the age of transition from one state to the other state. So in other words, Middle English is the period in which a lot of the loss of inflections takes place. So we're slowly moving away from the synthetic grammar of Old English, where things like a dative and an accusative and things like that were always marked in the respective words. Old English had a slightly freer word order than modern English does. Modern English has a very fixed word order. So again, Middle English, as an age of transition, maybe word orders are becoming more fixed than ever. Maybe the subject verb object rule that we have in English today is firmly establishing itself in the Middle English period. And another thing to think about, of course, is the one that I just spent a few minutes talking about, namely that Old English had an almost purely Germanic vocabulary. If you recall last week's session, I did mention that there were some words coming in from Latin here and there, but it's mostly a Germanic vocabulary. And now modern English has a very mixed vocabulary. And the big thing that happened there is, of course, the influence from French that occurred in the Middle English period. Now, back to some external language history. The Norman Empire started to fade, so to speak. So Normandy was lost after the year 1200. Which means that the English nobility, which was previously tied to France by properties, by relations, so they had houses on both sides of the channels, maybe on both sides of the channel. They maybe had families and relations on both sides of the channel. Now they were losing their estates, and they had to sort of make up their mind where they belonged, whether they saw themselves as Englishmen or as Frenchmen. And so to so there was this separation process going on after the loss of Normandy. Another thing that happened was a new feeling of rivalry between the two countries, which culminated in the long period now known as the 100 Years' War. This was not a war, this was a long period of open hostility between England and France. So French was now slowly becoming the language of an enemy country. And this leads to, of course, people maybe not wanting to speak as much French anymore, as you can imagine. The status of French was diminishing, and the maintenance of French in England became increasingly unnatural. By contrast, everybody spoke English, right? So the 95% anyway, but then the upper classes now were also switching over to using English rather than French sometime in the 13th century. William of Nassington, for example, writes about this in his Speculum Vitae, saying, "Both lærd and luwed, aldan jung, allunderstanden English tung." Yeah, sort of a little naive rhyme there. But what he's saying is, at the beginning of his work, it's all about the question, okay, why am I writing this in English now? Because that was still in the early 14th century, in the first half of the 14th century, this was still considered to be not the rule, to be writing sort of courtly literature, important literature, and this is a kind of rhymed chronicle. To write that kind of text in English rather than in Latin or in French. And so he's sort of justifying his use of English there. Well, everybody understands English, and I want everybody to be able to read this book, maybe. And so, yeah, that's why this is in English. So English was spoken by everyone. English was now being used in literature more and more. And in the later 14th century, the Parliament opened in English for the first time as well. And we also have the first letters coming up. Of course, upper class people write letters to one another, but they use English to do this for the first time in about 1400. Another thing that was going on, and that I really have to mention here, is the Black Death. This occurred around the year 1350, so it started in the summer of 1348. The bubonic plague swept through England, killing off around 30% of the population, with mortality rates being highest among the lowest social classes. Having so many people, so many lower class people die all of a sudden, led to a shortage of labor. Labor means people with practical jobs, like building houses, making roof tiles, making roads, and so on, just to name a few examples. And this led to them being in greater demand, and it ultimately led to a rise in wages. Wages was also a new system. The Norman system of feudalism, the system of villenage, where people would till ground and give a share of their crop to the person owning the land, but they didn't really own the land themselves. But they weren't really paid money for this. They were just allowed to live on that land, right? That was basically the earlier system. And this was now being replaced by a system of fixed wages. This might actually be the beginning of paying money for time, right? So that's kind of the way we see things today. I work for a certain time, and you give me money for that time that I invested in work. And this was a relatively new idea at the time. What this led to, all of these things led to a new independent, and as Baugh and Cable say, a sometimes wealthy and powerful class that stood halfway between the rural peasant on the one hand and the hereditary aristocracy on the other hand. Hereditary aristocracy means people who consider themselves to be noble by birth. And now you have these other people who are also starting to get rich, maybe if they live in the right place, if they're doing the right things. So you have them being paid for work. You also have a rise in the numbers of merchants. So you have people selling things at markets a lot more. And these kinds of things. People organizing themselves into guilds. So the large towns become larger and larger. More people are moving to towns. So it really is starting to be a different world. Right. One quick look at Middle English at the end of this presentation. And you can maybe see this as a contrast to the short passage from Wulfstan, which I presented in the first video. So this one is coming from John of Trevisa's Polychronicon, a late 14th century text. And I'll give you some glosses here right away. So what it says there is, in Britain byth many wonders. In Britain there are many wonders. Natheless for byth most wonderful. You can almost understand that, right? Natheless is nevertheless. The first is at Pectoon, there bloweth so strong a wind out of the chains of the earth, that it casteth up again clothes that men casteth in. Okay, I just wanted to point out a few things there. The grammar is really different from the grammar of Old English. How can I tell that? If you just look at the form the there. So there are no different forms of this article anymore. So there blows so strong a wind out of the chains of the earth, out of the caverns. Now you might think, what's so strange about this? If you're coming from modern English, that's the form you would expect. But if you're coming from Old English, this is not the form you would expect. You would expect there to be a plural form of the there. Out of the caverns of the earth. And then the earth is only one earth, right? So this is a singular form, but you don't distinguish that anymore. There's just quite simply the. And this was very, very different in Old English. It would also be different in modern German, for example, which would be also using a more synthetic grammar. But here you're clearly moving towards an analytic grammar. You also see what I mentioned earlier, the importance of prepositions out of the caverns of the earth, right? In earlier stages of the language, you would have had genitives, plural datives there, but you wouldn't necessarily have had so many ofs, and then always of the, right? And it's almost as if this can't really change its form anymore. Yeah, okay, so just to illustrate what Middle English is like, however, it also still looks very foreign to modern eyes because this writer or his scribes are using some different characters there, like the thorn. By now, you've probably figured out just from having me read it to you that the thorn stands for a TH sound. So for example, in the word the, right, it's thorny. Another thing you see here is the yoch symbol or the yoke symbol, which is to be seen in the last line down there in the word again, right? There's this sort of strange form of the G. Okay, in a nutshell, the Norman Conquest led to a language gap. Remember, upper classes, lower classes. And it led to a text transmission gap. Remember, there were about these 100 years during which no new English texts were being written. Middle English was regional and had no written standard and had no prestigious accents. There were very diverse spellings. Remember the 500 different ways to spell the word through, for example. Okay, furthermore, Middle English borrowed many new words from French. This really distinguishes it from Old English, for example. And Middle English was the time in which inflections were gradually lost. And then lastly, I said the loss of Normandy in 1204, the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, and the development of an English-speaking middle class ultimately helped English gain new prestige and become the #1 language in England again. Right, and that's the end of the Middle English period for now. Here are my sources. And yeah, the next video will then cover the early modern period.